The winter of 1892 had not yet arrived when Ada Voss stood at the edge of Kinder Creek and looked down at what she had built. 9 limestone terraces, each one bordered by clay walls she had pressed into place with her own hands. Cold frames angled toward the southern sky, and below the glass, in the dead of November, rows of lettuce so green they looked almost impossible, like something that had no business being alive in Missouri in the cold. She had been standing there 3 minutes when she heard boots on the frozen ground behind her. Roland Voss stopped at the edge of the upper field. He looked down at the terraces. He looked at the lettuce. He looked at Ada. Then he turned and walked back toward the main house without a single word. She watched him go. She had learned a long time ago how to read the silence of men. Her father had taught her. And what she read in Roland's silence that morning was not contempt. Not anymore. It was something older and harder than contempt. It was the particular quiet of a man who has just understood that he was wrong and cannot find the door to say so. 2 years. It had taken 2 years to bring him to that silence. This is where the story ends. But you need to understand where it began. Boone County, Missouri, March of 1890. Ada Drummond had been Ada Voss for exactly 6 months when her husband left. She was 22 years old. She had grown up in Callaway County, the only child of Frank Drummond, a farrier who worked out of a stone forge on Oxfast Road. Frank was the kind of man who spoke when he had something to say, and not one moment before. He had no sons, so he taught his daughter everything. The first thing he taught her was how to read metal. Cherry red meant too soon. Orange meant ready. White meant you had waited too long. And the iron had already started to forget what it was. Timing matters more than strength, Frank told her. He said it once, and never repeated it. The second thing he taught her was how to read weather. Not from almanacs, though he kept one. He taught her to read it from the land itself, the way the soil smelled 2 hours before rain, the way ants moved when the pressure dropped, the particular silence frogs made when a storm was close enough to matter. Everything out there warns you before it hits, he said. Most people just don't know how to listen. The third thing he taught her was how to read the silence of men. Frank Drummond died in December of 1888. Pneumonia. He was 51 years old, and the speed of it felt like a betrayal by something that should have warned her first. He left Ada $32, a stone forge that had to be sold, and a battered farming almanac from 1872 with a faded green cover. Most of it was ordinary. Planting charts, moon phases, advice about potato blight. But in the back, there was a chapter written half in English and half in French about the market gardens outside Paris, stone walls that absorbed heat during the day and released it through the night, glass bells placed over individual plants to trap warmth close to the leaves, rows of vegetables growing through the coldest months of the year, because someone had understood how stone held heat. Ada read that chapter many times. She did not understand all of it, but she remembered every word, the way a person remembers something they know they will need someday, without knowing when or why. Henry Stratton, no. That was another story. Martin Voss came to Callaway County in the summer of 1889 to buy a draft horse. He stopped at Frank's old forge, looking for someone to check the animal's hooves. Ada was living in the house behind it, taking and mending, stretching $32 as far as it would go. She checked the horse. The left front had a crack starting at the toe that would split within 2 months if untreated. She told him, He looked at her the way men looked at women who knew things about horses, with an expression caught between surprise and discomfort. Then he asked if she could treat it. She could. She did. By September, they were married. It was not a love story. Ada needed a roof. Martin needed a wife. Both of them understood this without saying it aloud, which was perhaps the most honest foundation a marriage on the Missouri frontier could have. She moved to the small frame house on the eastern edge of the Stratton, the Voss property, bringing with her the almanac, $32 reduced now to $11, and Wren. Wren was 9 years old. She was Ada's cousin's daughter, orphaned the previous winter when a fever took both her parents inside of a week. There was no one else. Ada had taken her in without discussion because there was nothing to discuss. Wren was small and quiet and observant in the way that children become when they have learned that the world can take things without warning. She slept on a narrow cot beside Ada's bed and asked very few questions and watched everything. Martin was not unkind. Ada recognized this and was grateful for it, but he operated at a frequency she could observe without ever quite reaching. He worked the upper fields with his father Roland from dawn until dark. He came home, ate, slept on his side of the bed with his back to her, not in anger, but in the way a man sleeps when he has forgotten someone else is in the room. She recognized his silence within the first month. It was the third kind, the kind her father had taught her about. Martin had already made a decision he was not going to explain. On the night of March 13th, she woke at 2 a.m. to find his side of the bed empty. She found him at the kitchen table, a piece of paper in front of him, a pen in his right hand, his left hand clenched on his thigh, the knuckles white, a single candle burning between them. He saw her in the doorway. He looked at her for 3 seconds. His eyes were not angry, not sad, not apologetic. They were the eyes of a man who had already left and was looking back at the place he used to be. Ada did not speak. She went back to bed. She did not sleep. She heard the pen scratch, then silence, then boots on the floor, then the door, then nothing. By morning the horse was gone. The rifle above the door was gone. The leather grip under the bed, the one that held $46, was gone. And on the kitchen table was a piece of paper. She read it. She folded it twice and put it in the inside pocket of her dress, against her ribs, where she could feel the edges of it when she breathed. 9 words. She will not tell you what they said. Not yet. Not until you understand what it cost her to carry them. Roland Voss arrived that afternoon. He did not knock. He stood in the center of her kitchen with his hat still on, which was how Ada knew he had not come to offer comfort. 10 days, Roland said. The house belonged to the family. The land belonged to the family. Martin's departure did not change the deed or the title, and Ada Drummond was no longer a Voss wife. She was expected to remove herself at her earliest convenience. Willa Voss stood on the porch behind him, holding a jar of pickled beets in both hands close to her stomach. The jar was a social gesture. It meant we are not heartless people. It meant please do not make this harder than it needs to be. Ada looked at the jar. She looked at Willa's face. She looked at Roland, who was already turning toward the door because in his mind, the conversation was finished. 10 days, he said again. Then he left. Ada stood on the porch after they were gone, both hands gripping the railing until her knuckles went white, until the grain of the wood pressed into her palms hard enough to leave marks. She held on like that until her hands stopped shaking. She did not know how long it took. She only knew that when she finally let go, the sun was gone, and the upper field was dark. She went inside. Wren was sitting on the narrow cot with her knees pulled to her chest, watching Ada with the careful eyes of a child who has learned not to ask the question she most wants to ask. "We have 10 days, Ada told her, "so we are going to use them." She spent the next 3 days walking every inch of the 240 acres she was about to lose. She was not being sentimental. She was investigating something. Kinder Creek, which ran year-round according to Roland Voss, which had never once gone dry in the entire history of the Voss occupation of Boone County, had not run since January. The bed was dry, not damp, not trickling. Dry. Limestone ledges that had been underwater for as long as anyone could remember were now exposed to open air, pale and flat, and stacked in natural terraces from the bank down to the center of the bed, 12 feet below. Ada walked the dry creek bed a quarter-mile in each direction. Then she knelt on the widest ledge near the center. She placed her right palm flat against the stone. It was warm. The air that morning was 41 degrees. The stone beneath her hand was at least 20 degrees warmer, holding the heat from hours of direct southern exposure. The creek bed ran roughly east to west. The south-facing bank rose steep behind her, which meant these terraces caught full sunlight from mid-morning until late afternoon without a single shadow falling across them. She had spent 15 years pressing her palm against heated iron to know when it was ready to work. The stone beneath her hand now was speaking the same language the iron had spoken in her father's forge. It was saying, "I hold what you give me. I give it back slowly. I do not forget." She thought about the chapter in the almanac. Stone walls absorbing daytime heat, releasing it through the night. She thought about these terraces beneath her knees, already shaped like the walls the French gardeners built, except no one had built them. The creek had, over 1,000 years, cutting steps into its own bed with the patience of water. She stood up. Wren had followed her down the north bank path and was standing on the terrace above, watching. Soot? Ada did not have Soot yet. That comes later. But Wren was there, small and quiet in her coat that was a season too thin. "Can we stay here?" Wren asked. Ada looked at the limestone around them. She looked at the south-facing bank, at the angle of the light, at the terraces dropping below her one by one like steps down into something that hadn't been named yet. "My father said stone holds what you give it," Ada told her. "It gives back slowly. It never forgets." Wren considered this. Then she nodded in the careful way she had, as if she were filing the information somewhere important. Ada helped her back up the bank. She had 7 days left, and she had just decided exactly what she was going to do with them. The county clerk's office smelled of ink and damp paper, and the particular staleness of a room where important decisions were made by unimportant men. Ada walked in on the morning of March 21st with the almanac under her arm and the folded letter still pressed against her ribs. She had Wren with her because there was nowhere else to leave her, and Wren stood beside the counter with her hands folded and her eyes moving carefully around the room, the way she always moved through spaces that belonged to other people. The clerk was a man named Silas Grout. He had held the position for 11 years and had processed claims for farmland, timber rights, mineral exploration, and one memorable request involving a drainage ditch and a proposed toll bridge. He had never seen anyone file a claim on a creek bed. He looked at Ada's form. He looked at Ada. He looked at the form again. "You understand this is a creek bed," he said. "Yes," Ada said. "That is currently dry." "Yes." "And you want to farm it." "Yes." Silas Grout looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man who has encountered something he cannot file under any existing category. Then he stamped the paper. He took her $1.25. And as Ada walked out of the office, he turned to the next person in line and said, quietly, but not quietly enough, that a woman had just paid for the right to grow vegetables at the bottom of a ditch. Ada did not look back. She had 6 days left on Roland's ultimatum. She used 4 of them finding the North Bank path that Chester Greer's old survey records indicated existed, cutting through overgrown sumac and wild grape with a borrowed hatchet until she reached the creek bed from the side that did not belong to the Voss family. And she used the remaining 2 days reading the almanac one more time, cover to cover, pencil in hand, marking every passage about soil depth and compost ratios and the angle of winter light until the margins were full and the last evening of March was gone. She left the frame house on the morning of April 1st. She did not look back at the porch. She did not look up at the main house on the hill. She walked to town with Wren beside her and rented a room above the dry goods store for $4 a month from the small reserve she had saved selling mended clothes through the winter. The room had one window facing east, a narrow bed, and a cot that Wren pushed against the wall and declared satisfactory. That night, Ada lay in the dark and listened to Wren breathe and thought about stone terraces and the angle of southern light and what the almanac had said about Paris. She thought about her father. She did not think about Martin. On the morning of April 3rd, Ada went to the creek bed for the first time with the intention of building something. She had no tools of her own. She had borrowed a wheelbarrow from the feed store in exchange for 2 days of mending, a debt she would repay the following week. She had the almanac. She had her hands, which were a farrier's daughter's hands, accustomed to weight and heat, and the particular resistance of material that does not want to be moved. She found the clay deposit half a mile upstream where the creek bank had collapsed during a flood years before, and left a vein of gray river clay exposed in the cut bank. She loaded the clay into the wheelbarrow and pushed it back along the dry creek bed, her boots slipping on the limestone, her shoulders burning, the wheelbarrow tipping and catching on every ledge. 6 trips a day, 200 yards each way. By the 3rd day, the bruise on her left shoulder had turned the color of a storm cloud, purple at the center and green at the edges. She had learned to push with her right side leading. She packed the clay into the cracks between the limestone ledges, building low walls 6 inches high along the outer edge of each terrace, pressing the clay into the stone the way a mason presses mortar into a joint, smoothing it, sealing it, so that when the rain came, the walls would channel water instead of crumbling. Then the compost. She hauled rotted leaves and horse manure from the tree line at the top of the south bank, filling the wheelbarrow with material so foul that she had to breathe through her mouth for the first 3 loads before her nose simply stopped objecting. She spread it across the stone terraces in layers 3 inches deep, dark and steaming in the April air, alive with the heat of its own decomposition. This is what she was building, and it requires a brief explanation. The French intensive terrace method had been used in the market gardens outside Paris since the 17th century. The principle was simple. Stone absorbs heat from the sun during the day and releases it slowly through the night. Low walls along the edges of a growing bed trap that heat close to the soil surface, creating a pocket of warmth that extends the growing season by 6 to 8 weeks in both directions, earlier in spring, later in autumn. Decomposing organic matter generates its own heat as it breaks down, adding 8 to 12 degrees above the ambient temperature on cold nights. And if the growing bed faces south on a steep slope, it catches maximum sunlight, while the slope itself blocks the prevailing north wind. The limestone terraces of Kinder Creek were already doing most of this work by accident. Ada only had to add the clay walls and the compost and the soil to make it intentional. That is the last time this will be explained. From here forward, the method will speak through what it grows. She was on her 4th day of hauling clay when she heard boots at the top of the north bank. She looked up. An old man stood at the edge, looking down at her with the careful expression of someone who has seen a great many things and has learned to withhold judgment until the evidence is complete. He was perhaps 70, with a surveyor's straight posture despite the stiffness in his knees that she could see even from 12 feet below. He held a burlap sack in both hands. He did not call out. He did not wave. He simply stood there until she had finished pressing a section of clay into the terrace wall and looked up at him properly. He set the sack on the edge of the bank. "Stone soil," he said. "Early rose does well." Then he turned and walked away. Ada climbed up and opened the sack. 12 pounds of seed potatoes, each one cut into sections with at least 2 eyes per piece. Each cut surface dusted with wood ash to prevent rot. The work of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. She stood at the top of the bank holding the sack and looked in the direction the old man had gone. He was already out of sight. She did not know his name yet. She would learn it, and when she did, she would learn why he had helped her. But that is a story that comes later, when it means more. She planted the potatoes on the lowest terrace, where the soil was deepest and the stone walls highest. And as she pressed each piece into the dark earth, she thought about a man who had carried 12 pounds of potatoes half a mile without being asked and had offered 6 words of explanation because 6 words were enough. What she did not see, because she was 12 feet below the bank with her hands in the dirt, was what happened 40 minutes later. The old man, his name was Edmund Greer, and he had served as Boone County's surveyor for 38 years before his knees gave out, walked back toward town along the edge of the upper field. Roland Voss was standing at the fence line. The 2 men saw each other at a distance of perhaps 50 yards. Neither spoke, neither waved, neither changed direction. But something passed between them in that silence, something that men of that generation understood without language. Edmund had chosen a side, and Roland had seen him choose it. They had known each other for 40 years. They were not friends. They were not enemies. They were 2 old men who had lived in the same county long enough to know exactly where the other one stood on every question that mattered. Now they stood on opposite sides of a 1/4 mile of dry limestone, and the woman between them was planting potatoes. By the middle of May, while every other farm in Boone County waited for the ground to warm enough to plant their first crop, Ada's lettuce was 4 inches tall. The radishes were showing their first true leaves. The spinach was dark and dense. The spring onions planted closest to the south bank were already thick enough to bunch, 3 weeks ahead of every field in the county. Not because Ada had better seed or richer soil, but because the creek bed held the night's warmth while every other piece of ground in Missouri gave it back to the sky by midnight. Wren came to the creek bed every afternoon after her lessons. She had appointed herself the record keeper of the operation and maintained a careful log in a composition book she had found in the room above the dry goods store, tracking which terraces were warmest at which hours and which plants were growing fastest and what the weather had been doing. She made her entries in a small, precise hand that was neater than most adults Ada knew. One afternoon in late April, Ada looked up from the terrace where she was thinning carrot seedlings to find Wren kneeling on the highest ledge with something in her hands. It was a piece of dark gray slate, roughly the size of a dinner plate, smooth on one side. "For my lessons," Wren said simply. "Mr. Callum runs out of slate at school sometimes. I thought if I had my own." Ada turned back to her carrot seedlings. She did not want Wren to see her face. She stayed turned away for longer than was necessary, pressing her fingers into the cool soil, breathing slowly. A 9-year-old girl in the middle of a survival situation, with $4 to her name and no certainty about winter, had found a piece of slate and thought about her education. Ada's father had told her once that a person's character revealed itself not in the large decisions, but in the small ones, the choices made when no one was looking and nothing was required. Wren had found a piece of slate and thought about her lessons. When Ada turned back, her face was composed. "That was good thinking," she said. Wren looked pleased. She stored the slate carefully at the end of the highest terrace, propped against the clay wall, where it would not be stepped on. On the last Saturday of May, Ada brought her first harvest to the Boone County market. She set up a borrowed plank between two barrels, laid her produce on clean flour sacks, and wrote her prices on a piece of slate. 2 cents a head for lettuce, 3 cents a bunch for radishes, 5 cents a pound for potatoes. The first customer was a woman named Mrs. Caldwell, who picked up a head of lettuce, turned it over twice, pressed the leaves with her thumb, and said it was the crispest lettuce she had seen since April. She bought 4 heads. By noon, Ada had sold everything she brought. She sat on the empty plank table after the last customer left with the flour sacks folded in her lap and held the coins in her right palm. $1.80. She looked at the money for a long time, not counting it, feeling it. These coins were different from every other coin she had ever held. No one had given them to her. Not her father, not her husband, not charity. Not luck. She had pulled them out of stone and dirt and composted manure with her own 2 hands. She remembered her father receiving payment for a shoeing. Frank Drummond always held the coins in his palm for 3 seconds before putting them away, not counting, acknowledging, as if the money deserved a moment of recognition for arriving honestly. Ada held the coins for 3 seconds. Then she put them in her pocket. Wren, who had been sitting on an overturned bucket eating an apple, looked up. "Good?" she asked. "Good," Ada said. Not everyone at the market that Saturday was pleased. Vera Holt had operated the largest vegetable stand at the Boone County market for 11 years. She had survived her husband's death, 3 lean winters, and the year the late frost killed half the tomatoes in the county, and she had done it while raising 3 children alone in a house that needed a new roof. She was not a cruel woman. She was a frightened one. And frightened people, in Ada's experience, were more dangerous than cruel ones, because they did not always know what they were doing. Vera watched buyers walk past her table to reach Ada's plank. She watched them buy lettuce and radishes from a 22-year-old girl who grew them in a ditch. And every head of lettuce that left Ada's table was a head that did not leave Vera's. By July, Ada was making $3.40 a week, more than a county school teacher's weekly wage, because she was the only vendor at the market with fresh greens in the height of summer. She was on her third succession planting, pulling crops from terraces that had been warming since April, while the flat fields above were still giving their warmth back to the sky every night. The women at the market asked her how she did it. She told them the truth. Stone terraces in the creek bed. They nodded politely and did not believe a word of it. But Vera Holt was not nodding. Vera was calculating. And by August, when her weekly earnings had dropped by a third, she had made a decision. The formal complaint arrived at the market board on a Thursday in late August. Vera's argument was specific. Ada Voss was selling produce grown on public land. The creek bed was unregulated. No one inspected the soil. No one verified the safety of food grown in a waterway. This was, Vera argued in a voice loud enough to carry past the feed store to the blacksmith and back, a threat to the health of every family that bought from her. She grows her vegetables on ghost land, Vera said. Land that belongs to nobody, that nobody inspects, that nobody is responsible for. The phrase had the shape of something practiced. It landed in front of Ada's table like a stone thrown into still water. The market board suspended Ada's selling privileges for 2 weeks pending review. 2 weeks in the middle of her best season, 2 weeks of lettuce and spinach growing in the creek bed with no market to receive them. 2 weeks of watching food reach its peak and pass it, because vegetables do not wait for bureaucracy. Ada went back to her rented room and sat on the narrow bed with her hands in her lap. She did not cry. She rarely cried, but she pressed her palms together until the knuckles ached, and she thought about what it meant to build something and have it threatened. Not by weather or soil or any failure of her own, but by the fear of a woman she had never wronged. Wren came and sat beside her on the bed without being asked. She did not say anything. She simply sat there, close enough that Ada could feel the warmth of her through her sleeve. After a while, Ada straightened her back. "We are not done," she said. Wren nodded. She had never thought they were. That evening, alone after Wren had fallen asleep, Ada did something she had not done since the morning she found it on the kitchen table. She took Martin's letter from the inside pocket of her dress. She held it in both hands without unfolding it, feeling the weight of it, which was almost nothing. She thought about what it had felt like to carry it all these months. The particular weight of a thing you cannot put down and cannot open. She thought about Roland arriving that afternoon with his hat still on, and Willa on the porch with a jar of pickled beets, and the 10 days that had become the creek bed that had become this room above the dry goods store, and the coins in her pocket, and the letter from the market board. She thought about Wren on the cot, asleep with one arm over her face. She almost opened the letter. Her thumb was on the fold. Then she put it back. "Not yet," she told herself. "Not until you understand what those words cost her to carry." She pulled out a piece of paper instead and began to write. A letter to Roland. She would ask to return to the frame house, just through the winter, just until she could find another arrangement. She would ask quietly, without anger, because Wren needed somewhere warm. And the room above the dry goods store grew cold enough at night that she could see their breath. She wrote 2 paragraphs. She read them back. Then she heard Wren shift on the cot. A small sound, half awake, and Wren said, without opening her eyes, "Are you writing to the mean man?" Ada looked at the letter. She folded it once. She held it over the candle flame. She let it burn. "Go back to sleep," she said. Wren did. The hearing was held the following Tuesday in the back room of the general store. The board consisted of 5 men appointed by the town mayor. Ada arrived alone. She had no lawyer. She had the stamped claim from Silas Grout's office and the almanac and nothing else. The rear door opened 10 minutes into the proceeding. Cora Hale walked in. Cora was 34 years old and had served as the only midwife in the southern half of Boone County for 11 years. She had delivered more than 200 babies in every kind of weather on a gray mare that knew the roads better than she did. She was unmarried by preference and had the particular authority of a woman who had sat with other people through the worst nights of their lives and had never once looked away. She had not been summoned. She had no official standing. But when Cora Hale walked into a room in Boone County, people made space because she had delivered their children and attended their wives. And there was a kind of authority that came from being the person who showed up at 3 a.m. when no one else would. She stood before the 5 men at the table and spoke without preamble. "I have eaten Ada Voss's vegetables for 3 months," she said. "No one in this room has gotten sick from them. I have seen where they grow and how she tends them. The soil is cleaner than half the kitchen gardens in this town." She paused. "If the concern is safety, I can tell you the food is safe. If the concern is something else, say so plainly, and let us discuss that instead." Silence in the room. The chairman, a hardware merchant whose wife Cora had attended through a difficult birth the previous winter, looked at his hands. The man beside him shifted in his chair. A third member stared at the wall above Cora's head with the expression of someone searching for an answer written in plaster. Vera sat in the back row with her jaw tight and her hands folded. The vote was 3-2. Ada could continue selling. She returned to the market the following Saturday with a table full of produce that had survived the 2-week gap by sheer biological stubbornness, and she sold everything by 11 in the morning. What she did not know, walking home from the market that Saturday, was that Vera Holt had not come. Vera had gone somewhere else. She had gone to speak with Roland Voss. Within a week, Roland had engaged the service of the county's circuit judge, a man he had known for 30 years, a man he fished with every spring on the Lamon River. The legal argument was elegant, and it was dangerous. Roland did not challenge Ada's right to use the creek bed. He challenged something simpler. The only way to access the creek bed was by descending the south bank. The south bank was the boundary of Voss land. Therefore, Ada had to cross Voss property to reach her claim, and Roland had every legal right to deny her passage across his land. The lock was not on the land. The lock was on the path. The hearing was scheduled for September at the Boone County Courthouse. Ada received the notice by mail. She read it at the table in her rented room, the same table where she ate her meals and counted her market earnings, and, on one night, she did not speak of afterward, pressed her palms together and stared at a letter she had not been ready to open. She set the notice down. She went to the window. The sun was going down behind the ridge, turning the upper field the color of old copper. She could see the roof of the Voss main house from here, and beyond it, the line of trees that marked the creek. She put her hands on the windowsill. She did not grip it. Her hands were still. The courtroom was half full on the morning of the hearing. Roland sat in the front row with his hat on his knee. The argument was presented. Ada stood alone at the respondents' table with her stamped claim in her almanac and the knowledge that she had no answer to what was being said, because what was being said was legally correct. The South Bank was Voss land. The South Bank was the only access. Roland had the right to close it. She was looking at the floor when the rear door opened. Edmund Greer walked in. He had not been summoned. He carried his surveyor's ledger under one arm and a roll of paper under the other, and he walked to the front of the room with the slow, deliberate pace of a man whose knees hurt, but who had decided that pain was not a sufficient reason to stay home. He did not ask permission to speak. He unrolled the paper on the respondent's table beside Ada, a hand-drawn copy of the original 1867 county survey map of the Kinder Creek drainage, large and detailed and precise, because Edmund Greer did not make errors. He stood in silence for 11 seconds. Ada counted them. Then he pointed to the map. The 1867 survey establishes a public right-of-way along the north bank of Kinder Creek, he said. His voice was flat, without emphasis. The voice of a man stating a measurement. The right-of-way was created when a federal canal project was proposed and has never been vacated from the county records. It runs the full length of the creek through the Voss section. It is overgrown and has not been maintained in 23 years, but it exists. He looked at the judge. The South Bank is not the only access to the creek bed. The North Bank has a public path. It is on this map. It is in the county records. Anyone may use it. Roland Voss sat in the front row and did not move. His face did not change. But something behind his face changed, something deep and structural, and Ada saw it because her father had taught her to see it. It was the expression of a man who has just discovered that the ground he was standing on is not as solid as he believed. The case was dismissed. Edmund rolled up his map. He closed his ledger. He walked toward the rear door without looking at anyone. As he passed Roland's row, the two men's eyes met, and in Roland's gaze there was something worse than hatred. There was the helplessness of a man who had wielded power his entire life and had just watched it mean nothing. Ada followed Edmund out of the courthouse. He was already 20 yards ahead, moving at his careful pace. "Why did you help me?" she asked. Edmund stopped. He did not turn around immediately. He stood still for a moment in the October light, and when he finally turned, something in his face was different from any expression she had seen on him before. Not the surveyor's careful neutrality, not the quiet assessment of a man deciding whether someone was worth 6 words. Something older than that. Something that had been stored for a long time in a place that did not often open. "My mother," he said, "was from Alsace. She came to America in 1832. She knew how to grow food on limestone terraces along the Rhine." He paused. No one ever asked her what she knew. "She died when I was 14. He turned back and kept walking. Ada stood in the street and let him go. She understood now. Edmund was not just helping her. He was finishing something he owed to a woman who had been dead for 57 years. A woman who had known how to make things grow on stone in a country that had never thought to ask her. She stood there a long time in the October light, with that understanding settling into her the way heat settles into limestone. Slowly, completely, without any drama. Then she walked back to the creek bed to check on the cold weather planting. The following week, Edmund came to Kinder Creek for the first time. He descended the north bank path one careful step at a time, gripping the limestone ledges with hands that were still strong, even if the knees beneath them were not. He carried a wooden crate containing 12 glass bells, cloches, each about 18 inches tall with thick walls and open bottoms. From the pocket of his coat, he produced a folded piece of paper covered in pencil drawings, a diagram of a cold frame built from salvaged window sashes and scrap lumber, angled at 37 degrees to catch maximum winter sun, every measurement noted in fractions of an inch. He set the crate down on the highest terrace. He unfolded the diagram. He handed it to Ada. "Cloche for October," he said. "Cold frames for January. You will grow through March." Ada took the diagram. She looked at it, then looked at the cloches, then looked at Edmund, who was standing on the terrace beside her, looking at the 9 rows of growing things in front of them with an expression she recognized, the expression of someone seeing something they had only known from a drawing, suddenly real. "Where did you get the glass bells?" she asked. Edmund looked at the terraces for a long moment, at the clay walls, at the dark soil, at the rows of spinach and the potato vines, and the lettuce growing in the cool October air. "My mother," he said, "was from Alsace." He said it the way a man says a prayer he has kept in his chest for a very long time. Then he climbed out of the creek bed and did not come back. He did not need to. He had given her everything he had. It was Wren who found Soot. It was a Friday afternoon in the middle of October, and Ada was building the cold frames on the widest terraces, scrap lumber from a demolished chicken coop, 4 window sashes from a widow moving to St. Louis. Total cost 85 cents. When she heard Wren's voice from the top of the north bank, she looked up. Wren was standing at the edge holding something against her chest, something small and gray and clearly not cooperative about being held. Ada climbed up. The dog was perhaps 8 months old, male, with wiry gray-black fur and one ear that had been torn at some point and healed badly, leaving the tip folded over. He was thin in the way of an animal that has been fending for himself, not starving, but careful, the way wild things become careful when they have learned that abundance is temporary. He was attempting to remove himself from Wren's grip with a focused determination that was being completely defeated by the fact that Wren was holding on with both arms and was significantly more stubborn than he was. "He was at the dump," Wren said. "He has been there 3 days. I checked." Ada looked at the dog. The dog looked at Ada with the wary assessment of a creature who has learned to read intentions quickly. "We barely have enough for ourselves," Ada said. Wren looked at Ada. It was not a pleading look. It was a patient one. The look of someone who has already made their decision and is simply waiting for the other party to catch up. Ada looked at the dog. The dog had stopped struggling. He was sitting in Wren's arms now, still watching Ada, and something in the way he was watching her was not wariness anymore. It was attention, the same kind of attention her father had described once, talking about horses, the particular look of an animal deciding whether someone was worth trusting. "Fine," Ada said, "but he earns his keep." Wren's face did not break into a smile exactly. It settled, the way a person's face settles when something they believed would happen has finally happened. She set the dog down on the limestone. He stood for a moment, sniffed the air, looked at Ada one more time, then walked to the entrance of the north bank path and sat down facing outward, as if he had already understood what the job was. Wren named him Soot for the color of his coat, and from that day forward, Soot slept at the entrance to the North Bank path every night and grew with the weeks, and never once in all the time that followed left his post without reason. By the end of October, Ada placed the cloches over the lettuce starts exactly as Edmund's diagram indicated, pressing each glass bell gently into the composted soil so the edges sealed against drafts. She built the cold frames on the widest terraces, angling them toward the southern sky at 37 degrees. On the 14th of November, she harvested lettuce. No one else in Boone County had fresh lettuce in November. She sold it at 4 cents a head, double the summer price. And people paid without argument because there was simply nothing else green for sale within 40 miles. On the last day of November, Roland Voss walked to the edge of the south bank and stood there for a long time. He looked down at 9 terraces of green under glass, at the clay walls glowing amber in the late afternoon sun, at 60 feet of limestone covered in more growing food than his own kitchen garden had produced all year. He stood there until the light changed. Then he went home and said nothing to Willa. But Willa knew. She had watched him walk to that spot every afternoon for 8 months. She knew because she had been married to Roland Voss for 30 years. And she knew because when he came inside that evening, he went straight to the back of the house and did not eat his supper. What she did not know, what no one knew yet, was what he was thinking about while he stood there. But in the tool shed behind the barn, there was a shovel leaning against the wall by the door, and 3 miles upstream there was an earthen dam, and the winter had not yet arrived. The thing about a secret kept for 30 years is that it does not stay still. It shifts. It settles into the walls of a house, into the habits of the man who carries it, into the particular way he says certain words and avoids certain others. It becomes indistinguishable from character. People who have known the man his entire life look at him and see a man of conviction, a man who knows what he owns and what it is worth, a man who can tap a table with one thick finger and say the creek runs year-round with the certainty of someone stating a law of nature. They do not see the dam. They do not see the earthen wall 3 miles upstream that Roland's father built in 1860 to create an irrigation pond, and that Roland had stood beside at the age of 20 and watched take shape, and that he had signed his name to witness in the county records in 1858, 2 years before it was built, when it was still just a proposal on paper with the words "may restrict downstream flow" written in a clerk's careful hand. He had been 20 years old. He had signed his name because his father asked him to. He had watched the creek slow over the following decade, and then slow further, and then one January it had simply stopped, and his father had stood on the south bank and looked at the dry limestone with an expression Roland had never forgotten. Not guilt, not regret, but calculation. "We don't speak of the dam," his father had said, and they had not. For 30 years, Roland Voss had stood on that south bank and told anyone who would listen that Kinder Creek ran year-round because of the quality of his land, because of something essential and irreplaceable in the 240 acres his family had worked since 1841. He had built his identity on this claim the way other men built identities on courage or faith or fortune. The creek was his. Its constancy was his. Its reputation was the foundation of everything the Voss name meant in Boone County. He had not thought about the dam in years. He thought about it now. November passed quietly in the creek bed. Ada harvested the last of the cold frame lettuce and replanted for December. She rebuilt the clay walls on the two lowest terraces where the autumn rains had softened them. She brought in $8.40 at the November markets, more than double what she had earned in any single month before. And she counted it at the table in the rented room above the dry goods store, with Wren asleep on the cot and Soot curled at the foot of the door. Callum Marsh came on a Tuesday afternoon in November, ostensibly to return a composition book Wren had left at the schoolhouse. He stayed for an hour. He drank a cup of coffee at the small table and talked with Wren about long division while Ada worked at the window mending a coat for the hardware merchant's wife. He had a way of sitting in a room that was different from most men Ada had known, not filling it with his presence, but occupying it carefully, as if he understood that the room belonged to other people and he was a guest. He came back Thursday. He said he had forgotten something. Wren, who forgot nothing, watched him go with an expression of quiet satisfaction. He didn't forget anything, she told Ada. Ada did not look up from the coat. I know, she said. Wren went back to her composition book. Ada kept mending. But something in the room had shifted very slightly, the way air shifts when a window is opened somewhere else in a house. A change in pressure, not in temperature, subtle enough that you could ignore it if you chose. Ada chose, for the moment, to ignore it. There was too much else to carry. It was Callum who found the damn records. He had not been looking for them. He was at the county clerk's office in the first week of November on school board business, waiting for Silas Grout to locate a property description for a parcel adjacent to the schoolhouse when he noticed a filing cabinet in the corner that was labeled Canal Projects, proposed 1855 to 1870. He was not sure afterward what made him open it. Professional instinct, perhaps. He had been a school teacher for 15 years and had developed the habit of reading everything in a room. Inside the cabinet, in a folder labeled Kinder Creek Drainage, Federal Right-of-Way Transfer 1867, he found the original proposal for the canal that had never been built, and attached to it a supplementary filing from 1858, an application for private water management infrastructure adjacent to the proposed canal corridor. The applicant was Harlan Voss. The witness signature was Roland Voss, age 20. At the bottom of the application, in the careful hand of a county engineer, note, proposed earthen retention structure may restrict downstream flow during low precipitation periods. Applicant acknowledges. Callum read this 3 times. Then he replaced the folder, thanked Silas Grout for the property description, and walked to the creek bed. Ada was on the 3rd terrace, sealing a crack in the clay wall with fresh material, when she heard him on the north bank path. She knew his step by then. Most people approached the creek bed tentatively, uncertain of the footing, but Callum had been coming long enough that he moved with the easy confidence of someone who knew where the loose stones were. She looked up. His face told her before his words did that this was not a Tuesday visit. He came down the north bank path and stood beside her on the terrace and told her what he had found. He said it plainly, without softening, the way he taught mathematics to his students. Here is the problem. Here are the numbers. Here is what they mean. The creek didn't dry up because of drought, he said. It dried up because of that dam. And Roland knew. He knew before it was built. Ada stood with her clay-covered hands at her sides and looked at the dry creek bed around her, at the terraces she had hauled and built and pressed into place by hand, at the cold frames angled toward the southern sky, at the rows of lettuce under glass that had no business being alive in November in Missouri. All of this, she said, was built on a lie. Not yours, Callum said. No, not mine. She picked up the clay she had been working with and pressed it back into the crack in the wall, smoothed it, sealed it. She worked in silence for a moment. Callum watched her without speaking, which was one of the things she had noticed about him. He understood when silence was not absence, but presence, when the most useful thing a person could offer was simply to remain. "Does anyone else know?" she asked. Callum was quiet for a moment. "There is one more thing," he said. He took her to Willa. Not to the main house. Willa was in the kitchen garden behind it, harvesting the last of the winter squash before the ground froze. She saw them coming and straightened slowly and held a squash in both hands the way she had held the jar of pickled beets 18 months ago. But her face was different. The practiced pain sympathy expression was gone. In its place was something Ada had not seen on Willa's face before. It was the look of a woman who has been waiting for a particular moment for a very long time and has finally seen it arrive. Willa set the squash down on the garden wall. She went inside. She came back with an envelope, old and soft at the edges from years of handling. "I have kept this," Willa said. She held the envelope toward Ada. "I don't know why. Perhaps I always knew this day would come." Inside the envelope was a copy of the 1858 application. Roland's signature, age 20, in the careful penmanship of a young man who understood that his name on paper carried weight. And in the margin, in different ink, added later, she thought, perhaps years later, 3 words in Roland's handwriting that were not part of the official document. "Father insisted." R.V. Ada looked at those 3 words for a long time. Father insisted. It was not absolution. It was not an explanation. It was simply the record of a young man who had done what his father required and had written 3 words in a margin 30 years ago that no one had ever read. A receipt for a guilt he had never paid. She folded the envelope and held it. Willa said nothing further. She picked up her squash and went back inside. Ada and Callum walked back toward the creek bed in silence. The November light was flat and gray, and the fields on either side of the path had the stripped, exhausted look of ground that has given everything it had and is waiting for winter to let it rest. "What will you do with it?" Callum asked. Ada looked at the envelope in her hand. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I'll know when I need to." She put the envelope in the inside pocket of her dress, beside the folded letter she still had not opened. 2 pieces of paper pressed against her ribs. 2 different silences. 2 different weights. She went back to sealing the clay wall. December came the way Roland's father had come 30 years ago, without announcement, without negotiation, with the absolute authority of something that does not require your consent. 21 degrees on the 6th, 17 on the 12th, and on the 23rd, the temperature fell to 9 degrees, with a wind out of the northwest that found every crack in every wall in every building in Boone County and pushed through it like a finger testing for weakness. The creek bed held. Ada checked the cloches every morning before first light, climbing down the north bank path in the dark, her lantern making a small orange world in the black air. The lettuce under glass was alive and green in temperatures that were killing everything else in the county. The cold frames held the heat of the previous day's sun through the night, creating pockets of warmth that should not, by any reasonable measure, have existed. Wren came with her on the morning Soot was restless. and in the week before Christmas, Soot began to be restless every morning. He had been a calm dog since October, calm in the particular way of animals that have found their purpose and are content within it. He patrolled the North Bank path in the evenings, slept at the entrance, and woke at intervals through the night to check the perimeter, which was simply what he did, as naturally as breathing. But in the week before Christmas, he began to pace, short circuits back and forth across the room, stopping at the door, stopping at the window, sitting down, and then standing again. Ada watched him and said nothing for 3 days. On the 4th day, she said to Wren, "Something is coming." Wren looked at Soot. "What kind of something?" Ada looked at the sky through the eastern window. It had been the same color for 2 days, not the flat gray of ordinary December, but a particular yellow gray, the color of old bruising, the color the sky made when pressure was building behind it toward something it could not hold. "I don't know yet," Ada said, "but we should be ready." She went to the market that Saturday and said, as quietly as she could manage while still being heard, that the weather was building toward something large. She said it to the hardware merchant, to the grain dealer, to the woman who ran the boarding house on the east side of the square. She said it to Reverend Aldous Pruitt, who was buying dried beans at the general store counter. Reverend Pruitt looked at the sky. He looked at Ada. He said, with the gentle patience of a man explaining something to someone who does not yet understand how things work, that only God knows the hour. Ada said she understood. She went to the next stall. At the far end of the market, a group of young men were standing around Clem Barker's wagon. Clem was 23, broad-shouldered, and had made a small reputation for himself over the past year by maintaining what he called the pool, a running wager on when Ada Voss would give up on the creek bed. The pot had grown to $4.60. No one had won it because Ada had not given up. Clem looked at the sky. Then he looked at Ada, who was walking past. "The ditch girl's scared of sunshine," he said, loud enough to carry. The men around him laughed. Ada did not stop walking. She went home to the room above the dry goods store and told Wren to make sure the cold frames were sealed on all 4 sides. She checked the supply of potatoes and carrots stored in the Hessian bags at the back of the highest terrace. She brought 2 extra quilts down from the room and stored them in the cold frame at the eastern end of the creek bed. Wren watched all of this without asking questions. Then she said, "Should I be worried?" Ada thought about this honestly, because Wren was 9 years old and deserved honesty. "I think so," she said, "but worried is all right. Worried means you're paying attention." That evening, Willa came. Ada did not know she was coming. She heard a knock at the room door. A quiet knock, the kind that does not want to be heard by anyone except the person on the other side, and opened it to find Willa standing on the landing in her good coat with her hands folded in front of her. Ada stepped back. Willa came in. She looked at the room, the narrow bed, the cot, the small table, the almanac open on the windowsill, Soot sitting against the far wall watching her with the careful attention of an animal taking measure of something unfamiliar. She looked at Wren, who was on the cot with her composition book and her piece of slate. Wren looked back. "Could you give us a moment?" Ada asked. Wren went to the cot's far corner with the composition book and held it open in front of her face, which was her version of privacy. Willa sat at the small table. She set her folded hands on the surface. She looked at them for a moment, the hands of a woman who had folded and unfolded them in silence for 30 years, through suppers where she had nodded at the right moments and held jars of pickled beets and stood on porches while other people's lives were being dismantled. Then she looked up. "Roland took the shovel from the tool shed last night," she said. Ada went still. "He came back before dawn," Willa said. "He did not tell me where he had gone. But I know where the dam is. I have always known where the dam is." She reached into her coat pocket and produced a piece of paper. A hand-drawn map, careful and precise, with distances noted in feet. The location of the dam marked with a small cross. She placed it on the table. "I drew this tonight," she said while he was sleeping. Ada looked at the map. At the small cross at the end of the creek, 3 miles upstream. At the distances noted in Willa's careful hand. "Why?" Ada asked. Willa was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was level and very quiet. "Because I have held the jar of pickled beets," she said, "and I am tired of holding it." She stood. She picked up her coat from the back of the chair. She looked at Wren, who lowered the composition book. "You are doing well in your lessons," Willa said. "Your penmanship is better than Roland's was at your age." Wren blinked. "Thank you," she said. Willa went to the door. Ada walked with her. In the doorway, Willa paused. She did not turn around. "He is going to say it was erosion," she said, "if anyone asks. He already decided that while he was at supper." She went down the stairs. Ada stood in the doorway and listened to her boots on the steps, then on the floor below, then the outside door, then nothing. She went back inside. She looked at the map on the table. She looked at Wren, who was watching her with the careful eyes of a child who has heard more than the adults in the room intended. "Go to sleep," Ada said. Wren lay down on the cot and closed her eyes. She did not say anything, but she reached down and placed one hand on Soot's back, where he had come to lie beside her, and Soot put his chin on her knee and was still. Ada sat at the table. She did not sleep. She woke at 2 a.m. to a sound she had not expected. Not wind, not the settling of the building. Water, moving fast, coming from the direction of the creek. She was dressed and out the door in 3 minutes. She ran the road to Kinder Creek in 12 minutes in the dark, following the path by memory, her lantern swinging at her side, her breath tearing out of her in white clouds. She heard it before she reached the north bank, the sound of water moving over stone, a sound that had no business being there in January in a creek bed that had been dry for nearly a year. She reached the top of the north bank path and looked down. Water. Black water moving fast, already covering the lowest terrace, already reaching the second. The potatoes. 60 pounds of early rose potatoes on the lowest terrace, the descendants of the 12 pounds Edmund Greer had carried to the bank in April, buried in soil that had taken Ada 14 days to build and 9 months to cultivate. The water was over them, and it was rising. She went down the north bank path without thinking, because thinking would have made her stop, and she could not stop. The water hit her boots at the second terrace, and the cold was absolute. Not the cold of winter air, which touches skin and retreats, but the cold of water that has been sitting behind an earthen dam in January, the cold that reaches through clothing and through skin and into bone, and stays there. She began lifting the cloches. Each one weighed 8 pounds of solid glass, and her fingers were numb by the time she reached the third. She carried them 2 at a time up to the highest terrace, the one farthest from the water, setting them down with the care of a woman handling something irreplaceable, because they were irreplaceable. Chester's mother's knowledge, carried across an ocean and through a century, shaped into glass and placed in her hands by a man who had waited 57 years to give it to someone who would understand. She would not let the water take them. The cold frames were heavier, waterlogged lumber, stiff hinges. She wrestled the first one free and dragged it up 2 levels, her boots slipping on wet stone, the frame catching on every ledge. The second she could not lift alone. She braced it against a clay wall and pushed. 6 inches. She pushed again. 6 more. The water reached her calves. She could no longer feel her feet. On the 6th cloche, she slipped. Her right boot hit a patch of wet limestone at the wrong angle, and her leg went out from under her. She fell sideways, and her left knee struck the edge of a terrace with a sound she felt in her teeth. She lay in the black water. It was 8 inches deep, perhaps 10, but it was cold enough to stop her thinking, and for 1 second she was not Ada Voss, farrier's daughter, creekbed farmer, carrier of 2 folded pieces of paper. She was just a body in cold water in the dark. And in that second, a thought came. Simple and clear. Just go. Walk out of this creek bed and this county and this life. Find somewhere warm. Let the water take it. Then her hand, reaching for something to grip, found the stone. And through 8 inches of near-freezing water, through the numbness in her fingers and the pain in her knee, and the cold that had stopped her thinking, she felt it. The stone was warm. She grabbed the edge of the terrace and pulled herself up. She stood in the dark water with her knee bleeding and her hands shaking, and the sound of the water filling everything around her. The stone was warm. It had held the heat of the previous day's sun through the flood, through the cold, through 8 inches of January water. It had held it the way it always held things, slowly, completely, without letting go. She kept going. Light appeared at the top of the south bank. Not sunlight, lamplight. A single oil lantern held at arm's length by a figure standing at the edge of the Voss property. Willa. She had not come down. The bank was steep and wet, and Willa was 57 years old and had not climbed anything of consequence in a decade. But she stood at the top of the south bank and held the lantern high, and the light fell down into the creek bed like something thrown to a person who was drowning. 2 sentences came across the cold air with the clarity of a bell. Roland left the house at midnight. I saw him take the shovel. 30 years of marriage. 30 years of silence. 30 years of nodding at the right moments, of holding jars, of standing on porches while other people's lives were decided. And now, at 2 a.m. in 4-degree air, standing on her husband's land with a lamp that he would notice was missing if he came home before she did, Willa Voss had chosen to speak. Ada looked up at the lamp. She looked at Willa's face above it, the face of a woman who had made a decision and was standing in it, whatever it cost. Then she went back to the cloches. They did not speak again. The light held steady. The water moved. Ada worked. She saved 7 of the 9 terraces. The 2 lowest were gone. 60 pounds of potatoes. 9 months of work undone in a single night by a man with a shovel and a grievance he could not name, who had signed his name at 20 to say the water could be stopped, who had watched it stop, who had spent 30 years saying it never would, and who could not, in the end, bear to watch a woman prove that something could grow in the silence his lie had made. The water receded over 2 days. The dam had nothing more to give. The creek bed returned to its dry state as if the flood had been a bad dream. Ada stood on the lowest terrace the morning after the water left and looked at what remained. The soil gone. The clay walls reduced to smears of gray on the stone. The straw mulch carried downstream. She sat down on the bare limestone. The stone was cold now. The water had taken its warmth, and the January air had not yet given it back. She sat there for a long time. She was not thinking about Roland or the dam or the potatoes buried under silt at the bottom of the terrace. She was thinking about whether there was a limit to what a person could rebuild, whether she had reached it. She looked at her hands resting on the cold stone. They were still, not shaking, still. Her father had told her once that a person's hands would tell the truth before their mind would. When they shook, you waited. When they were still, you could continue. She stood up. She went to get the wheelbarrow. The winter of 1892 arrived 6 weeks later. Not the slow settling cold of ordinary January, but something that had been building since November. Since the yellow-gray sky and Soot's pacing and the particular pressure Ada had felt in her ears for 3 days before it arrived, the way her father had taught her to feel a storm before it showed itself. On the evening of December 18th, the temperature dropped to -12 and kept going. By midnight, it was -26. By 3 in the morning, it was -38. The wind came from the northwest at 65 miles an hour, and the visibility dropped to nothing. Not reduced, not limited, but gone entirely, as if the world beyond the reach of a lantern had simply ceased to exist. Soot had been pacing for 4 days. Ada had spent those 4 days moving between the market and the creek bed and the houses along Main Street, saying the same things she had said the previous November. The weather is building. Something large is coming. The creek bed will hold. If you need shelter, come. The hardware merchant's wife listened politely and said she appreciated Ada's concern. The grain dealer looked at the sky and said it looked like regular winter to him. Reverend Pruitt said, again, that only God knows the hour. Clem Barker said, to no one in particular and everyone within earshot, that the ditch girl was going to lose the pool money she'd saved right along with the rest of her vegetables. Ada went home. She made sure the cold frames were sealed on all 4 sides. She checked the potato stores on the high terraces, the ones that had survived the flood, replanted through the spring of 1891, and grown through the summer, and stored now in the Hessian bags on the highest ledge. She brought the 2 extra quilts into the creek bed. She brought the composition book and 3 candles and the almanac. She brought Wren, who came without being asked, who had been watching the sky for 4 days with the careful attention of a child who has learned to read what adults ignore. And she brought the 2 pieces of paper from the inside pocket of her dress. She did not know why. She only knew that if something was coming, she wanted everything that mattered close to her. The storm hit at 8 in the evening, not gradually, all at once, the way catastrophe arrives when it has been patient long enough. The wind hit the walls of the creek bed, and the sound was not howling, not what people mean when they say a storm howls. It was shrieking, a living sound, a sound that had intention behind it, the sound of something trying very hard to tear the world apart at the seams. Inside the creek bed, the temperature held at 47 degrees. Outside, it was -38 and falling. Wren sat on a quilt on the highest terrace with Soot beside her and her composition book open on her knees, though she was not writing in it. She was listening to the storm the way she listened to things she had decided to understand. Ada sat beside the cold frame and watched the entrance to the North Bank path. She was not surprised when, at 9:15, there was a sound at the entrance that was not the storm. She was not surprised. She had known, in the way her father had taught her to know things, through the accumulated evidence of animals and air pressure and the color of a sky in November. She had known this was coming too. She stood up. She walked to the entrance of the North Bank path with her lantern, and she opened it. They came one at a time, the way people come to a door they are not sure will open. The first was Vera Holt. She was carrying her youngest, a girl of 6 named Pearl, small even for 6, with dark hair plastered flat against her face, and lips the particular blue that Ada recognized from her father's teaching about cold. Not the blue of cold that has touched and retreated, the blue of cold that has gone inside and started working. Vera did not speak. She stood at the entrance to the North Bank path in the screaming dark, with Pearl pressed against her chest and 2 other children behind her, a boy of 10 and a girl of 8. And she looked at Ada with an expression that had nothing left in it. No pride, no calculation, no fear of what asking would cost. There was only Pearl's blue lips and the sound of the storm and the light from Ada's lantern falling on Vera's face. "Come in," Ada said. "Get warm." That was all. "No, I told you so." No conditions. No accounting of what had been filed at the market board 2 years ago, or what had been said in a loud voice about ghost land and unregulated soil. None of that existed in this moment. Only Pearl's lips, and the cold, and the light. Vera carried Pearl down the North Bank path, and Ada guided the older children behind her. The second was Reverend Aldous Pruitt. He arrived 12 minutes later. His coat was soaked through on the right side where the wind had driven the snow horizontally against him for the 3 blocks between the church and the creek. His hands, when Ada took them briefly to check, were the white of hands that have been outside too long. Not blue yet, but moving toward it. He looked at Ada in the lantern light. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the patient, explanatory expression of a man describing how the world worked to someone who did not yet understand it. Something else. Something that had been scraped clean by 3 blocks of 65-mile-an-hour wind. He did not speak. "Come in," Ada said. "Get warm." He went down the path. After the Reverend came the inspector who had processed Roland's legal filings against her. He came with his hat still on, which struck Ada as almost funny. The habit of authority so deeply embedded that even at negative 38 degrees, in a storm that had reduced visibility to the length of an arm, the man kept his hat on. He said nothing. He looked at the entrance to the path, and then at Ada, and then back at the entrance, and she saw him make the calculation that men like him made, the weighing of what it cost against what it would cost not to. And then he stepped through. "Come in," Ada said. "Get warm." Clem Barker came at 10 o'clock. He came alone. He was 23 years old and broad-shouldered and had maintained a betting pool on Ada's failure for 2 years. And he came to the entrance of the North Bank path with his hands shaking so badly that she could see it from 4 feet away, even in the dim lantern light. His lips were moving but not making sound, the particular shutdown of a body that has been too cold for too long and has begun conserving resources. He did not look at her face. He looked at a point somewhere past her left shoulder, which was the closest he could manage to meeting her eyes. She stepped aside. "Come in," Ada said. "Get warm." By 10:30, 16 people were in the creek bed. Ada had built 9 terraces across a quarter-mile of limestone, and the space between the clay walls and the cold frames and the limestone itself was more than she had ever imagined filling with bodies. But bodies generate heat, and heat was what they had. And the creek bed, the structure of it, the stone walls, and the southern exposure, and the clay, and the compost, and the 57 years of a French woman's knowledge made real in Missouri limestone, held it all. The temperature inside did not drop below 44 degrees. Outside, at midnight, it reached -41. Ada organized the space the way her father had organized his forge, not by sentiment, not by rank, not by any consideration except function. The people who were coldest went on the lowest terraces where the stone was warmest. Children went in the center. Adults with the most body heat went on the outer positions where the cold came through the clay walls in thin fingers that needed blocking. Pearl Holt went on the lowest terrace. Ada knelt beside her and looked at her lips, still blue at the edges, but less so. She checked Pearl's fingers, cold but responsive. She wrapped her in one of the quilts, the heavy one, and tucked it around her legs and under her chin. Pearl looked up at her from the quilt with eyes that were very large and very dark. "Are you the lady who grows things underground?" Pearl asked. Ada smoothed the quilt over Pearl's shoulders. "I am," she said. Pearl considered this. "Are we underground now?" "We are." Pearl looked at the limestone ceiling above her, at the cold frames, at the glass catching the candlelight. "Like seeds," she said. Something settled in Ada's chest. "Very much like seeds," she said. She stood and moved to the next person. Wren had appointed herself to the children. This had happened without discussion. Simply Wren moving among the younger ones with the quiet competence of a child who has understood for some time that the adults in a room are not always the most useful people in it. She had Soot with her, and Soot had understood his assignment as clearly as Wren had understood hers. Pearl's older brother, the boy of 10, whose name was Thomas, was sitting with his back against the clay wall of the middle terrace and his knees pulled to his chest and his eyes fixed on nothing. He had the particular stillness of a child in shock, not the stillness of sleep or calm. The stillness of a body that has locked itself against what it has experienced and is not yet sure whether to unlock. Wren sat beside him without speaking. She had Soot's lead in her hand, and after a moment she simply held it out toward Thomas, the way you hold out a hand to an animal you are not sure of, not pushing, not pulling, just offering. Thomas did not move for a long time. Then he reached out and took the lead. Soot shifted, settled his chin on Thomas's knee, and sighed. A long, warm, completely satisfied sigh. The sigh of a dog who has found the exact right place to be and intends to stay there. Thomas made a sound that was not quite a word. He put his free hand on Soot's back. Wren opened her composition book. "Do you know how to play 20 questions?" she asked. Thomas shook his head. "It's easy," Wren said. "I'll show you." She did not look at him while she said it, which was the right instinct. Not pressing, not watching to see if it worked. She just opened the book and began explaining the rules as if the game were already underway, as if the question of whether he would participate had already been answered. After 3 minutes, Thomas answered a question. Ada, moving between the terraces with a candle, saw it and kept moving. Vera was sitting on the second terrace with Pearl asleep across her lap when Ada came to check on her an hour after midnight. Vera looked at Pearl's lips, which were pink now. She looked at her for a long time. Then she looked up at Ada. "I filed that complaint," she said, "because I thought if you succeeded, there would be nothing left for me." Ada sat on the terrace beside her. She did not say it was all right, because it had not been all right. 2 weeks in the middle of her best season, lettuce going past its peak. The particular helplessness of watching something she had built be threatened not by weather or failure, but by a fear that had nothing to do with her. It had not been all right, but Vera was sitting here with Pearl's pink lips in her lap, and the storm was outside, and the stone was holding its warmth the way it always held things. "You would have had a neighbor," Ada said, "who understood what it costs to build something." Vera was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know that now." It was not an apology, exactly. It was something more specific than an apology. The acknowledgement of a woman who was made an accounting and found the numbers come out differently than she thought. Ada understood it for what it was, because her father had taught her to read the silence of people as well as the silence of men. And what she read in Vera's voice was not guilt performing itself, but something quieter and more durable. "I want to learn the cold frames," Vera said. Ada looked at the cold frames angled along the high terrace, catching the candlelight. "After the storm," she said. "After the storm," Vera agreed. Pearl shifted in her sleep. Vera put a hand on her back, the automatic hand of a mother, the hand that moves before the mind decides to move it. Ada left her and moved on. Reverend Pruitt was sitting on the third terrace with his coat spread across his knees, drying. His hands were the right color now, not white, not blue, but the ordinary weathered pink of a man's hands in winter. He was looking at the cold frames. Ada sat beside him. He did not speak immediately. He had the manner of a man composing something, not a sermon. Not the kind of composition that requires an audience, but the kind that requires honesty. "I told them," he said at last, "that only God knows the hour." He paused. "But you knew." Ada looked at the glass of the cold frames, at the lettuce inside growing through the worst night Boone County had seen in 20 years. "My father taught me," she said. "He said everything out there warns you before it hits. Most people just don't know how to listen." Reverend Pruitt was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "My seminary spent 4 years teaching me how to speak." He looked at the stone around him. "It did not spend a single hour teaching me how to listen." Ada did not say anything. She let the sentence stand on its own, the way her father had let things stand, not filling the silence because the silence was where the meaning lived. After a moment, the Reverend said, "I would like to hold the service of Thanksgiving here when the storm passes." "In the creek bed?" Ada said. He looked at the limestone walls, the cold frames, the candles burning in a space that had held 47 degrees all night, while the temperature outside had fallen past the limits of most thermometers. "Where else would be appropriate?" he said. Callum found her at 2 in the morning. He had arrived with the Reverend, had been helping the older man through the last block before the creek when the wind had taken the Reverend's hat, and they had both decided the hat was a loss they could bear. He had helped settle 3 of the shivering adults on the upper terraces, had carried Pearl from the entrance to the lowest terrace when Vera's arms had given out, had done everything that needed doing without being asked how. Ada was checking the clay wall on the eastern end of the second terrace. There was a section she had been watching for 2 days. A slight bow in the wall where the pressure of the composted soil behind it was testing the seal. She pressed her palm along the surface, feeling for temperature change, for the particular coldness that meant a draft was getting through. Callum sat beside her on the terrace and watched her work. "She is asleep," he said, meaning Wren. He had checked. Thomas Holt was asleep beside her with his hand still on Soot's back, and Wren had her composition book open on her knees and was asleep over it, the way children fall asleep over things they intended to finish. "Soot?" Ada asked. "Awake," Callum said. "Watching." She pressed the clay wall again. It was holding. She became aware, sitting there in the candlelight with the storm outside and 16 people sleeping around them and the stone holding its warmth the way it always had. She became aware that her hand was resting on the limestone beside her, and that Callum's hand was resting 2 inches from hers, and that neither of them had moved for some time. He said quietly enough that only she could hear, "She trusts you completely." He meant Wren. Ada looked across the creek bed at the small figure asleep over her composition book, at Soot's gray shape beside her, solid and present. "She doesn't have a choice," Ada said. Callum was quiet for a moment. Then, "She does. She made it a long time ago." Ada looked at the stone under her hand, at the warmth coming up through the limestone, patient and constant, the warmth that had been there before the Voss family came, and before the county was surveyed, and before anyone thought to write down who owned what. She thought about what it was to be chosen, not needed. That was different. Chosen. The particular weight of being the person someone has decided to trust. She did not move her hand. Neither did he. Wren woke before the dawn, the way she often woke, suddenly, completely, as if she had only been pretending to sleep and had decided the pretense was no longer useful. She sat up. She looked around the creek bed at the sleeping shapes, at the candles burned most of the way down, at the cold frames still holding in the gray pre-light. She looked at Ada and Callum, sitting against the clay wall of the second terrace, both asleep now, both upright, Ada's head tilted slightly toward her own shoulder. Wren looked at this for a moment with the expression of someone confirming a theory they have held for some time. Then she looked at Soot, who was awake and watching her. "I know," she said softly to Soot. "I've known for a while." Soot's tail moved once, agreement, or something close enough to it. Wren pulled her composition book onto her lap and turned to a fresh page, and began, in her small, precise hand, to write down the temperature she estimated from the air against her face, the number of candles remaining, the approximate hour. She was recording what had happened here. She had understood, without being told, that this was something worth recording. Pearl stirred on the lowest terrace, opened her eyes, saw Wren. "Is the storm over?" Pearl asked. "Not yet," Wren said. "Soon. How do you know?" Wren considered the question seriously, the way she considered all questions. "Soot stopped pacing yesterday afternoon," she said. "When the worst part is over, he usually stops." Pearl looked at Soot. "He's like a thermometer," she said. "More like a barometer," Wren said. "But yes." Pearl sat up carefully, testing her legs, and moved to sit beside Wren. She looked at the composition book. "What are you writing?" "Everything," Wren said. so we don't forget. The fever broke at first light. Ada had not realized she had fallen asleep until she woke to Wren's hand on her shoulder, and for one disorienting moment, she did not know where she was. And then the limestone was under her palm, and the warmth of it came up through her hand, and she was fully present. Wren's face was calm. "The fever broke," she said. "Pearl's all right." Ada stood. She went to the lowest terrace. Pearl was sitting up with the quilt around her shoulders and color in her lips. Real color, the pink of a child who is alive and warm and interested in what is happening around her. Pearl looked up at Ada. "Can I see the lettuce?" she asked. Ada lifted the nearest cold frame. Inside, in the gray morning light, 3 rows of lettuce, deep green, fully alive, leaves so crisp they almost seemed to ring when the cold air touched them. Pearl reached out and touched a leaf with one finger, very gently, as if it were something that might decide not to be real if pressed too hard. "It's warm under there," Pearl said. Ada looked at the limestone under the cold frame, at the warmth it had held through the longest night she could remember, through 41 below and 65-mile winds and 16 people who had not believed her. "It always is," Ada said. Outside, between one moment and the next, the screaming of the storm dropped to a lower register, then lower still. Then the wind was just wind, cold and present, but no longer trying to take the world apart. Wren looked up from her composition book. She looked at Soot, who had been still for the past hour, his chin on his paws, his breathing slow and even. She wrote the time in the composition book. She wrote, "Storm ended, everyone alive, stone held." Then she closed the book and held it in her lap and looked at the pale light beginning to find its way down the south bank, the first real light in 3 days, touching the limestone terraces one by one like a hand moving along a familiar surface. Ada stood at the entrance of the north bank path and looked up at the sky. Blue. Not the blue of cold that has gone inside and is working. The blue of morning. The blue of something finished. She turned back to the creek bed, to the 16 people beginning to wake, stretching, blinking, reaching for children and checking on neighbors with the tentative movements of people discovering that they have survived something and are not yet sure what to do with that information. She looked at all of them. She thought about what her father had said, that everything out there warns you before it hits. That most people just don't know how to listen. She thought about what it meant to have listened, to have built the thing that listening told her to build in the place where no one thought anything could grow. At the cost that it had cost, 16 people, she had not built this for them. She had built it to survive, and then to make something that was hers. And then because the stone was warm and the knowledge was real, and Wren had found a piece of slate for her lessons, and there had been no other choice, she was willing to live with. But 16 people had come in out of the cold, and she had opened the door. That was enough. For now, that was enough. She went back into the creek bed to check on Pearl. The storm left Boone County the way a fever leaves a body, not all at once, but in stages. The cold retreating degree by degree until the morning of December 21st arrived clear and still and brutal in the particular way of days that follow catastrophe, when the sky is too blue, and the light too sharp, and the damage is visible all the way to the horizon. Ada climbed the north bank path at first light. She stood at the top and looked at the town. 3 roofs had collapsed under the weight of the ice. The Caldwell house on the east side, the grain dealer's storage barn, and the boarding house on the square, whose owner had turned Ada away 18 months ago with the explanation that she had no rooms available, which had been true, and which Ada had understood even then was not the reason. A line of fence posts along the upper field had snapped clean at the base and lay in the snow like a sentence with all the punctuation removed. The road through the center of town was buried under 2 feet of drifted snow, packed so hard it would take a week of above freezing temperatures to shift. And at the far end of the main street, in front of the small house with the blue door, a figure was sitting on the front step in the cold. Ada recognized the set of the shoulders before she recognized the face. Silas Grout. He had not come to the creek bed. They found him at 7 in the morning, when Clem Barker and the Reverend were making their way back through the drifts toward their own houses, and saw him sitting there. He was upright, which was what had confused them at first. They had expected someone unconscious or fallen, not someone sitting with his hands in his lap and his back straight, as if he had sat down to wait for something, and the waiting had simply gone on too long. He had been the county clerk for 11 years. He had stamped Ada's claim for the creek bed on a March morning in 1890 with the expression of a man who has encountered something he cannot file under any existing category. He had told the next person in line about it. A small betrayal, not a cruel one, simply the instinct of a man whose life offered few enough stories worth telling. He had not come to the creek bed when the storm arrived. Ada did not know why. She suspected it was the same reason Roland had not come. Not hatred, not even stubbornness exactly, but the particular paralysis of a man who has defined himself by a certain kind of dignity for so long that the act of abandoning it, even to survive, feels like a kind of death he cannot choose. She stood at his funeral 3 days later. It was held in the church with the repaired windows. The Reverend had organized a work party the morning after the storm, and by the second day, the glass was back in the frames, imperfectly but sufficiently, and the church was cold but usable. The congregation was small. Several families were still occupied with the immediate work of surviving the aftermath. Wren stood beside Ada and held her hand. After the service, walking back along the cleared road, Wren said, "Should we have gone to get him?" Ada considered the question honestly. "We offered," she said. "We went to every door." Wren was quiet for a moment. "He stamped your paper," she said. "The one for the creek." "He did. So he helped you once." Ada looked at the snow-covered upper field, at the line of broken fence posts not yet cleared, at the roof of the Voss main house visible above the ridge. "Yes," she said. "He helped me once. We should be sad then," Wren said. "Not because he was kind, necessarily, but because he didn't have to die that way." Ada looked at her. Wren was 9 years old and had lost both her parents to a fever and had lived for 18 months in a room above a dry goods store and had slept through a blizzard in a limestone creek bed. She had a composition book in which she recorded temperatures and growing conditions, and Ada now knew the things she observed about people when they thought she was only writing down numbers. She was 9 years old, and she was right. "We should be sad," Ada agreed. "That's different from forgiving him." Wren nodded slowly, filing it. Roland came on the 3rd day after the storm. Ada was on the 2nd terrace, resealing the clay wall that had bowed slightly during the cold, pressing fresh clay into the joint with her palms, smoothing it. The familiar work of a body that knows its task. Soot was at the North Bank entrance. Wren was at the schoolhouse, which had reopened that morning, the first building in the county to resume its regular operations. She heard Soot shift, not a growl, not alarm, but the particular adjustment of a dog who has identified someone approaching and is reserving judgment. She looked up. Roland was standing at the top of the south bank. He was 62 years old, and he looked, in the thin December light, every year of it. His coat was the good coat, the one he wore to church and to the county fair, and to any occasion that required the appearance of a man who owned 240 acres and knew it. He had his hat in his hands. He was not wearing it. He looked at the creek bed, at the 9 terraces, 7 fully intact and 2 in the process of being rebuilt, at the cold frames still holding their angles toward the southern sky, at the clay walls with their fresh patches, at the place that had held 16 people through the worst night in 20 years, while his own house, 240 acres of it, had offered warmth only to him and to Willa. And Willa had left it to stand on the south bank with a lantern. He looked at all of it for a long time. Ada set down her clay and waited. Roland looked at her. The creek always ran, he said. His voice was not loud. It was the voice of a man saying something in a register below argument, below justification, below the familiar certainty that had carried him through 62 years. I thought it was because of my land. He stopped. The wind moved between them, cold and without opinion. I was wrong, he said, about what held the water. He was not looking at her now. He was looking at the stone terraces below him, at the warm limestone that had held its heat through the flood he had sent down it, and through the coldest night in a generation, and through everything he had done, and not done, and said, and not said. He put his hat back on. Then he turned and walked back toward the main house. Ada watched him go. She watched until he had crossed the upper field and gone through the door, and the door had closed behind him. She stood there a moment longer, looking at the place where he had been. Then go, she said, quietly, to no one. She picked up her clay and went back to the wall. Willa came that evening. She came down the north bank path for the second time. The first having been the night of the flood, when she had stood on the south bank with the lantern. This time she descended all the way, one step at a time, one hand on the limestone, her bad knees protesting every inch. She stood on the 3rd terrace and looked around at the creek bed. Ada was resealing the eastern wall and did not stop working when Willa arrived, which was, she thought, the right thing. Making Willa wait would have been unkind, and making too much of her arrival would have been worse. He said it? Willa asked. He said something, Ada said. It was the most I think he could. Willa looked at the clay walls, at the cold frames, at the composition book Wren had left open on the highest terrace with a stone on the corner to keep the pages from turning. He sat by the window this afternoon, Willa said. For 2 hours. He didn't speak. He just sat. Ada pressed clay into the joint and smoothed it. After a moment, Willa said, I don't know if he will ever say more than he said today. Ada looked at her hands on the clay wall. He said he was wrong, she said, about what held the water. That is the most important part. Willa was quiet. Then, yes, I think it is. She reached into her coat and produced a jar. Pickled beets. The same shape, the same color, the same careful grip Ada had first seen on a porch 18 months ago. Ada looked at the jar. For the first time in their acquaintance, Willa smiled. It is not a peace offering, she said. It is not an apology. It is simply winter, and I have too many, and you do not have enough. Ada took the jar. She held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it. Not heavy, not light, but exactly as heavy as it needed to be. Then she set it on the highest terrace beside Wren's composition book. "Stay for a while," she said. Willa looked at the creek bed around her. She sat down on the third terrace, carefully, with the dignity of a woman managing difficult knees, and folded her hands in her lap. And for the first time in 30 years, Willa Voss sat somewhere that was not her husband's house and did not hold anything. Edmund Greer died in February of 1895. He was 76 years old. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, which was what doctors wrote in that era for any death they could not explain in a man old enough to justify it. He died in the stone house he had built with his own hands, in the bed he had slept in alone for 30 years. His will was read at the county clerk's office by a different clerk now, Silas Grout's replacement, a young man from Columbia who had not yet formed strong opinions about creek beds. The will was brief. Edmund left his stone house and his 2-acre lot to Ada Voss. He spelled her name correctly. Attached to the will was a single line in the same precise hand that had drawn the cold frame diagram and the map that had twice saved everything she had built. "The terraces will outlast everything else. Build on stone." Ada went to the stone house that afternoon. She had been inside once before, on the morning she had asked about the property line, 2 days before Roland told her she had 10 days to leave. The house was the same, spare and clean, the smell of wood smoke so deeply embedded in the walls that it would never leave. The kitchen table worn smooth at the edges from years of use. The surveyor's ledger on its shelf. The window facing south, the same window Edmund had looked through every morning for 30 years. On the kitchen table, she found a small notebook. Leather cover, soft with age. Pages yellowed and covered in handwriting that was not Edmund's. Smaller, more fluid, written with the quick confidence of someone who had learned penmanship in a different country, in a different language, in a different century. The notebook was in French. Ada could not read French. She had known this since the almanac, since the chapter about the Paris gardens that had defeated her in the French sections and yielded only partially in the English ones. She sat down at Edmund's table and opened the notebook and looked at the pages she could not read. But she could read the drawings, diagrams of terrace gardens built on limestone ledges, cross-sections of stone walls showing heat absorption and release, sketches of cloches placed over lettuce starts, the exact shape, the exact proportion of the glass bells Edmund had carried to the creek bed in October of 1890, notes in the margins in the same flowing hand, with measurements and angles and ratios that she recognized even without the language, because she had lived them. A woman from Alsace, dead for 57 years when Edmund gave Ada the cloches, whose knowledge had traveled from the Rhine to Missouri in a leather notebook through a boy who grew into a man who kept the book for half a century, waiting for someone who would understand what it meant. Ada sat at Edmund's table and held the notebook in both hands and wept. She had not cried when Martin left. She had not cried when Roland gave her 10 days. She had not cried in the floodwater or during the market board hearing or on any of the nights she had lain awake in the rented room above the dry goods store, listening to Wren breathe and calculating whether she had enough. She had not cried when she had climbed out of the floodwater, with her knee bleeding and her hands shaking, and forced herself to keep going. She cried now, not from grief, not from pain, not from exhaustion, but from the sudden understanding that she had never been alone. There was a line made of knowledge and stone, and the particular stubbornness of women who refused to let what they knew die with them. And it ran from a girl on the Rhine, through a boy in Missouri, through a battered almanac, through a farrier's daughter in a dry creek bed. The line had gone underground for decades. It had been forgotten and unnamed and unasked about, but it had not broken, and she was standing in it. She stayed at the table for a long time. When she left, she took the notebook with her. She kept it for the rest of her life. Callum proposed on an evening in April of 1895, standing on the second terrace of Kinder Creek with his boots muddy from the spring planting and no particular plan, as far as Ada could tell, for how to say what he had come to say. Wren was on the highest terrace, recording the first lettuce measurements of the season and making a studied effort to appear fully absorbed in this task. Callum looked at the creek bed. He looked at Ada. He said, "I have been coming here for 5 years." Ada waited. "I think you know why," he said. She looked at Soot, who was sitting at the North Bank entrance, watching both of them with the expression of a dog who has known the answer to this question for considerably longer than the humans involved. "I do," she said. Callum said, "Wren told me last Tuesday that the answer was yes." Ada looked up at the highest terrace. Wren was writing in her composition book with great concentration and had not looked up once in the past 4 minutes, which was, in Ada's experience, unusual. "She told you that," Ada said. "She did." Ada looked at Soot again. Soot's tail moved once, a slow, certain arc. "She's not wrong," Ada said. Callum did not say anything further. He simply looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize over 5 years of Tuesday and Thursday, and sometimes Wednesday visits. The expression of a man who is exactly where he intends to be and is not in any hurry. Ada looked at the creek bed around her, at the 9 terraces, rebuilt and planted, at the cold frames angled toward the sky, at the clay walls and the composted soil and the rows of early lettuce just beginning to show their first true leaves, at Wren on the highest terrace, writing down everything. "All right," she said. "The years after that pass the way good years pass, not without difficulty, not without loss, but with the particular quality of time that is lived in the right place, doing the right work, with the right people." Vera Holt learned the cold frames. She was a quick student, not because the method was simple, but because Vera had been farming for 20 years and already understood what Ada was doing, the moment Ada explained it in terms of heat and stone rather than luck and mystery. By 1896, Vera had built 4 terraces of her own along a south-facing slope at the back of her property. By 1898, she and Ada were sending buyers to each other's market tables with the wordless efficiency of 2 women who have stopped competing and started understanding. The Reverend held his Thanksgiving service in the creek bed on the first Sunday after the storm, as he had said he would. 43 people attended, which was more than fit comfortably in the space, and those on the outer terraces stood in the cold without complaint, which Ada thought was appropriate. Clem Barker disbanded the betting pool. He did this without announcement, simply stopped collecting. The pot of $4.60 was never formally distributed. Ada did not know what became of it. She did not ask. Soot died in the spring of 1900. He died the way he had lived, in the right place, at the right time, without fuss. He was 10 years old, which was old for a dog of his constitution, and he had spent every one of those years doing what he had decided, on his first afternoon at the creek bed, was his purpose. He died on the lowest terrace, in the sun, with his chin on Wren's knee. Wren was 19 years old, and did not try not to cry. They buried him at the end of the North Bank path, beside the limestone, where the ground was soft enough to dig in April, and where the stone would hold the warmth through the long nights. Wren chose the epitaph and cut it herself into a flat piece of limestone with Edmund's old chisel. It said, "He stayed." In September of 1909, a young woman arrived in Boone County from St. Louis wearing shoes that were entirely wrong for creek beds. Her name was June Hartley. She was 25 years old and had read about French intensive gardening methods in a farming journal published out of Philadelphia, and had not been able to believe that someone had already built one in Missouri until she had written 3 letters to the Boone County Agricultural Office and received confirmation that yes, there was a woman named Ada Voss who had been farming limestone terraces in a dry creek bed since 1890. Ada took her down the North Bank path on a Tuesday afternoon in September. They walked the full half-mile, Ada pointing out the cold frame positions and the drainage patterns and the places where the clay walls needed rebuilding every spring. June listened and asked careful questions and wrote everything in a notebook that was, Ada noticed, almost exactly the same size as the leather notebook from Alsace. At the widest terrace near the center of the bed, June stopped. She looked at the stone around her. She looked up at the south bank, steep and high, blocking the view of the upper field. She looked at the cold frames stacked at the eastern end, waiting for October. Then, without being told, without any instruction from Ada, she knelt and placed her palm flat against the limestone. She was still for a moment. "It's warm," she said. There was wonder in her voice. The wonder of someone touching something they have only read about and finding it real. Ada stood on the terrace above and watched her. She did not say anything. She did not explain why the stone was warm, or how long it had been warm, or how many people had pressed their palms against it and found the same thing. She watched June discover it with her own hand, the way Ada had discovered it with hers 19 years before. The line had reached forward again. She signed the papers the following week. $212. More than 4 times what the Voss family had valued the land their house sat on. Ada moved into Edmund's stone house permanently that autumn. In 1924, Wren published a book. She was 43 years old by then, a naturalist living in Colombia, and the book was a translation of the Alsace notebook into English, the first complete English translation of what turned out to be a significant document in the history of intensive gardening methods in North America. She had spent 11 years on it, learning French first, then working through the careful drawings and the precise marginalia of a woman who had grown food on limestone terraces along the Rhine when she was 16 years old, and had never been asked what she knew. The dedication page read, "For A.V., who read the stone before she read the book, and for the woman from Alsace, who wrote it down so no one would have to learn alone." Ada was 56 years old in the autumn of 1924. She was sitting on the chair outside the stone house, Edmund's chair, worn smooth at the arms from 30 years of his hands and now from hers. When Wren's youngest, a girl of 7 named Frances, came around the corner of the house at a run and stopped in front of her. Frances had Wren's eyes and her mother's habit of asking questions that were more precise than they appeared. "Did you really grow vegetables underground?" Frances asked. "I grew them where nobody thought anything could grow," Ada said. Frances considered this. "Wasn't it hard?" Ada looked at the girl's face, serious and curious and entirely unafraid of the answer. "Put your hand on that stone," she said. "The wall beside you. Tell me what you feel." Frances turned and placed her palm flat against the limestone wall of Edmund's house. She stood still for a moment, her eyes going to some middle distance the way a child's eyes go when they are paying attention to something other than what they can see. Then, "It's warm." Ada closed her eyes. "Good," she said. "Then you already know the most important thing." Frances took her hand from the wall. She looked at it, then at Ada. "What is the most important thing?" Ada opened her eyes. The afternoon light was falling long across the yard, turning the limestone the color of warm bread. "That what holds the heat," she said, "gives it back. Always. To anyone willing to feel what is there." Frances thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. Then she ran back around the corner of the house, the way children run when they have been given something they need to go and think about. Ada sat in the chair and listened to her go. The stone wall beside her was warm in the October sun. It would hold that warmth through the night and give it back tomorrow, the way it had given it back every day for 1,000 years before the Voss family came, and before the county was surveyed, and before anyone thought to write down who owned what. The stone did not care about deeds or titles, or the pride of men who believed they owned the water. It held what it was given. It gave it back slowly, completely, to anyone willing to kneel down and put their hand against it and feel what was there. Ada Voss had known this since she was 22 years old and standing in a dry creek bed with her palm flat against the limestone on a 41-degree morning in March. A woman from Alsace had known it before her, and somewhere down the North Bank path, on the limestone terraces of Kinder Creek, the stone was warm. It had always been warm. It was warm still.